Okay, so today I will talk to you all about the Urban Forest Initiative's Climate Adaptation Project that has 3 different sub-projects in 3 different urban tree canopies in Lexington. So the first is at the Arboretum State Botanical Garden of Kentucky. The second is on UK's main campus, and the third is occurring in Lexington's residential areas. But first, I wanted to give you all a little background on the organizations that I work for. So the Urban Forest Initiative is a collaborative group of University of Kentucky and Lexington community stakeholders whose purpose is to promote and protect the urban tree canopy at UK, in Lexington, and throughout the region. So we have a working group which meets 6 times a year. That's composed of various community tree partners. And we also have a core team that does various projects, the Climate Adaptation Project being one of them. The Arboretum is a 100-acre public garden and living museum on UK's campus. And so what that means is that each of our specimen has detailed records about where that plant came from, what condition that plant is in, how big it is, and where it's located on the Arboretum's campus. We have 3 different sections of the Arboretum. The Walk Across Kentucky Native Plant Collection contains 2,500 woody specimen native to Kentucky, and the majority of them are wild collected from the various regions of the state. We also have the horticultural gardens and displays, including the Kentucky Children's Garden, and those are primarily horticultural specimens. And we have 1,500 woody specimens in that collection. And then we also have the Arboretum Woods, which is a remnant forest. The goal of the Arboretum in sum is conservation and public education of Kentucky's flora. So to kind of ground us in this conversation, I wanted to share with you all some projections of how climate change will affect the state of Kentucky. So some expected changes are increased temperatures, increased drought. So the total amount of water running off into rivers or recharging groundwater is likely to decrease by 2.5 to 5%. Increased rainfall, meaning how much rain falls when it does rain, and then the amount of rainy days that we'll see. And then the consequences of these changes are vast, but they affect water, storm events, agriculture, forests, and human dimensions. So first, climate change is expected to impact water. So we'll have a greater risk of flooding, and with that, a greater risk of landslides, especially in the eastern half of Kentucky. There will also be an interruption of water navigation, including the transportation of commercial goods. So here you have a picture of a dried Ohio River in Paducah, which impacted commercial transportation in 2005. Rivers and reservoirs also might start to dry up, which of course will impact the ability of people to have access to drinking water and electricity production, especially for the Ohio, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers. Climate change will also create more dramatic storm events. And that's due to the increased moisture in the atmosphere due to hotter temperatures, which increases evaporation and basically just creates the perfect system for increased precipitation and storms. The storm events that we'll see will be much more severe, as we saw in December with the devastating tornadoes in Western Kentucky. So Tornado Alley is moving northeast toward Kentucky, and then those storm weather events are happening in unexpected times of the year, like we saw in the winter. Kentucky is a huge agriculture state, as you know, and so the longer frost-free growing seasons and increased levels of carbon dioxide may at first increase crop yields, but due to the increased drought, those crops will suffer and be strained, and so we may not have high enough crop yields that we need for our exports and feeding the state. Livestock will also suffer, which is also really important production in the state. This still is especially true for West Kentucky, where we're expecting more days of over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Forests will also be impacted as climate change poses new insect and disease threats to forests. So a few years ago, we saw the emerald ash borer wipe out ash trees in Lexington, and that continues to be a threat for Western Kentucky as well. Increased temperatures and rainfall may change forest composition. So we'll talk about shifting distribution later in the presentation, but this also applies to the built environment. So the trees that are well suited for the current environment may not be well suited in the future. Increased droughts will increase forest productivity, will decrease forest productivity. And then there's also an increased risk of forest fires, as we saw during the 2019 drought in the Red River Gorge. Finally, climate change will of course impact human dimensions. So due to higher temperatures, folks will have a greater risk of strokes, dehydration. It increases ground level ozone, which can provoke asthma and other lung diseases. And these impacts will be more severe for vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, children, and low-income residents. There will also be an influx of climate refugees coming from outside of the state into Kentucky because we are a more inland state, and while we will be seeing severe impacts of climate change, they may not be as severe as these coastal cities or in the western half of the United States. So we need to be prepared for that increase of new residents into Kentucky. But also, we're all interconnected, and climate change impacts everyone. So importantly, things that happen halfway across the globe will impact Kentucky and vice versa. So recognizing that climate change is a global issue as we live in a globalized world really puts into perspective how serious climate change is. So there are two main ways of addressing climate change, particularly in urban forestry. One is mitigation, which is basically reducing the carbon emissions of humans. And the other is adaptation and resiliency, which is essentially preparing for the inevitable, because even if we stopped carbon emissions now entirely, we would still be seeing effects of climate change. And so preparing our cities and our urban forests for climate change is how we can adapt and be resilient in the face of a changing climate. So a question that we've been asking ourselves with the Urban Forest Initiative and at the Arboretum is, how can urban and community forests help us address climate change? Urban forests are really important mitigators and adapters of climate change. So the various urban tree benefits that I'm sure some of you are familiar with is that trees sequester carbon dioxide, they provide shade and cooling, reduce stormwater runoff, and improve mental health, all of which are really important in mitigating and letting us adapt to climate change. But climate change also poses a threat to urban forests with increased storm events, drought and precipitation, pests and pathogens, and shifting climate and temperatures. Our urban forests need intentional care and management in order to remain healthy and resilient in the face of climate change. And just a disclaimer, I'm referring to these forest systems as urban forests, but they also are applying to all community forests in rural areas as well. So the way that I think of climate adaptation in urban forestry is the ability of our urban forests to respond to climate change, avoid future canopy losses, and support a healthy tree canopy. Essentially, climate resiliency. Sorry, I'm waiting for the next slide to show up. Okay, so one way that we think about climate adaptation and resiliency within the urban forest is climate vulnerability ratings. These ratings are developed from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, who we worked with in 2020 to think through climate adaptation in our urban forests. So these climate vulnerability ratings are an assessment of how well a species will perform on the landscape using environmental, biological, and social factors, as well as climate projections. So here we have a map of the distribution of a tree species. I'm not sure exactly which one it is, but on the left side, there's the current distribution of that species. And then on the right side, there's the future projection based on an average of 3 different climate projection models. So the US Forest Service put together these models that essentially tell us, with the expected climate projections, where will this tree species potentially be in the future? And that kind of gives us an idea of geographically which areas might be best suited for those trees. And so when we think about climate adaptation, that allows us to think about, well, maybe we should be planting species that are projected to do well here in the future, rather than species that may not be as well adapted to Lexington or other areas of Kentucky's current climates. And so it's thinking ahead, and that way, when those trees grow up, they might be better suited for the new conditions that we'll be seeing with climate change. Another element of the climate vulnerability ratings is their adaptive capacity, which is essentially a measure of how well that species is projected to adapt to climate change. So this is based on two different factors. You have biological and disturbance factors. The biological factors has to do with the way that the life history of that species and the life form of that species. And so it takes into consideration the unique soil conditions, its tolerance to shade, its fire regeneration capacity, etc. The disturbance factors has to do with how that species responds to various disturbances, such as browsing, drought, flooding, invasive plant competition, disease, etc. So I have two different examples here of species that are currently in Lexington. So Osage orange is projected to have a high adaptability to climate change. And that's due to its, to various elements, but just some things that I wanted to point out are that it doesn't have a very high habitat specificity, which allows it to adapt to various environments. It also is fairly tolerant to flooding, drought, insects, disease, and temperature gradients. So given all that we know about how climate change is expected to change Kentucky's climate, this might be a good species to plant because of its resiliency to all of these different factors that are expected to become more dramatic with climate change. In contrast, Eastern white pine has a low adaptability to climate change. This is due to its intolerance to drought, insects, disease, and its sensitivity to various temperature gradients. So this just kind of gives you an idea of the different ways that we think about climate adaptability on a species level within our urban forests. So we have these vulnerability species and their species specific, or these vulnerability ratings and their species specific scores. And so in order to use them, we need to perform tree inventories and assessments of our tree canopies. So this helps us understand the tree canopy and lets us look at things like biodiversity, health class distribution, size class distribution, and later climate vulnerability once we have put those ratings or attach those ratings to the species that we have. We can also look at patterns associated with the tree canopy. So within Lexington street tree canopy in residential areas, we've been able to look at the ways that the tree canopy is unequally distributed across socioeconomic status and neighborhood age, which is of course an environmental justice issue. So once we took inventories and did some assessments, we found some things about Lexington street tree canopy. So I'll just highlight a couple of findings. We recorded 123 different species. And again, this is just in the street tree canopy. So this doesn't include parks or private residential trees, but just where the tree or the easement between the sidewalk and the road in residential areas. But we recorded 23 different tree species. Almost 30% of that was red maple, and another 17.5% of that was Callery pear. So that's fairly problematic when we think about our tree canopy species composition. Some good news is that almost 70% of the street tree canopy was in good condition. Our tree species are primarily smaller trees, less than 16 inches in diameter, which is good because it allows our tree canopy to regenerate. And then in terms of vulnerability, almost 34% of street trees had a moderate to high vulnerability rating. So that's something to look out for as we manage and prepare our urban forests for changing climate, that almost 34% of the species are fairly vulnerable to climate change. In terms of these kind of more human elements, younger neighborhoods were less diverse than older neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that were built between 1990 and 2010 had about 45 different species compared to the 116 species recorded in neighborhoods built between 1900 and 1950. Younger neighborhoods had a higher stem density, so they had more trees, but their trees tended to be smaller, which makes sense because newer developments tend to have trees planted on every street, and they're younger, and so they haven't had time to grow up yet. And so as far as socioeconomic status goes, low socioeconomic status neighborhoods had lower stem density than higher income neighborhoods. And so they tend to have less trees, and those trees also tended to be smaller. So these are areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change because they don't have tree canopy cover to keep them cool, and that can lead to health effects on those community members. And then they also had a higher number, low income neighborhoods also had a higher number of empty tree wells in higher income neighborhoods, which means that trees once replaced were not removed. And so that's something that we need to address on a government level. Just a couple important takeaways from our findings is that there's significant tree deficits in Lexington street tree canopy and low socioeconomic status neighborhoods, which is an environmental justice issue. Newer neighborhood developments need to prioritize tree diversity because, 45 different species compared to 116 different species, that's serious, and we need to be increasing tree species diversity as we plant more trees. And then these two tree canopies in lower income neighborhoods and then in newer neighborhoods are more vulnerable to climate change because there are less trees in low income neighborhoods and the trees are less diverse in newer neighborhoods, which makes them susceptible to future diseases and pests that may wipe out the tree canopy entirely. So we talked about various elements of the tree canopy, tree species diversity, climate vulnerability, but importantly, right tree, right place is essential in climate adaptation. So we need to have diverse tree canopies. We need to have tree canopies that are well adapted to climate change, but we also need to be planting trees in spaces that can support them. This is especially important in residential areas where we're relying on private homeowners or landlords to take care of those trees and support them into maturity. So if we don't connect humans with the trees in the built environment, then those trees may be very diverse or have really high adaptability to climate change, but may not do so well if they're not being maintained and cared for. Likewise, we need to make sure that the trees have good soil conditions and that they're not just planted in fill soil, and that they're properly planted so that they can be resilient in the face of climate change, which will only add stressors. So with our findings, we are creating tree reports. And the purpose of those reports is to share our findings, educate stakeholders, and help inform future management decisions. So the report that we have finished so far is the Lexington Street Tree Report, which we presented to the Lexington Tree Board and urban forest managers in the city of Lexington. And the goal behind that is so that we can ensure that future policy decisions are made in a way that supports a climate resilient tree canopy. We're also working on the same type of report for the Arboretum. And we have a Arboretum climate adaptation plan with the goal of working toward climate resiliency in the Walk Across Kentucky collection. The Arboretum is a hugely important resource for the state, as it is a conservation arboretum. So we're conserving biodiversity from the state of Kentucky, and so ensuring that the Arboretum is well adapted to climate change is hugely important. Not to mention, it is such an important source of greenery in the city. So what next? We have looked at the tree canopy from a scientific perspective. We've kind of evoked policy in some of that. How do we further ensure that these climate adaptation initiatives are seen through in our cities? So importantly, climate adaptation is a community-wide issue. People play a critical role in climate adaptation, as I mentioned, with humans having a really important role to play in the care of trees and our urban forests. And so increasing community awareness and involvement with our tree canopies and with the decisions that we are making to help promote climate resiliency across our urban forests is really important, especially when we think about environmental justice issues and the need for diversity and inclusion in decision-making processes within government and within communities. This should happen in tandem with scientific research and policy. And so if we can get folks involved with scientific initiatives, not just at the labor stage, but also at the decision-making and project planning stage, then that can really go a long way in helping to promote environmental justice in communities. Likewise, getting folks involved with policy decisions and trying to connect with our government and community leaders in helping to promote climate resiliency, because our tree canopies can be well adapted to climate change, but ensuring that our communities are well adapted to climate change is a whole other thing. So one way that we've been doing this in Lexington is through an initiative called Climate Conversations, which came out of Tree Week 2021. The goal with Climate Conversations is to encourage folks to imagine climate resilient communities and have climate conversations together. So it's a really kind of low effort way of engaging with climate change in a very human and inclusive way. So one thing that we've done is to embark on a yard sign campaign. So you can see the yard signs here and here. And these yard signs encourage folks to imagine climate resiliency. And so the idea is that this art will bring people into the conversation rather than push them away. And we can start imagining climate resiliency together. And then maybe that can form future policies or encourage folks to get involved with the urban tree canopy or community gardening or various other ways that folks engage with climate resiliency. And so if you're interested in ordering a sign, you can do so at southlandprint.com. A couple of upcoming community events that are tied into this work is a tree inventory workshop at the Arboretum on Saturday, this Saturday, May 14th at 10 a.m. Where folks will learn basic tree ID and assessment skills. And you can email the Arboretum if you're interested in attending that. And that workshop directly ties into a community-wide parks inventory, which will be happening this summer. There will be 4 of those where we'll gather data about trees in Lexington's public parks as a part of one more leg of this journey of climate adaptation with a community parks inventory. And we will perform similar assessments on our parks to kind of figure out what types of trees are there and how we can start managing those forests for climate change. So I will leave you with a challenge, which is to have a climate conversation today that can be pretty small or in depth. So just within the spirit of climate conversations and imagining climate resiliency, I encourage you to have a climate conversation.